Good evening and welcome to our Bible study tonight. And let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, I just ask that you would help us tonight as we look into subjects that are confusing to many people. Father, I just pray you would help us to find clarity, guidance from your word, insight into how it is that you would have us to live and to relate to people of diverse faiths in this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Obviously, the world that we live in is filled with various different religious beliefs, and even among Christians, there are varieties of beliefs so broad and that it divides us into various different denominational groups. But it's important for us to make distinctions with regard to the essential doctrines of the various different faiths that people believe around the world. And when we talk about Christianity, and we kind of try to codify what Christianity believes, even there we find ourselves sort of caught up in controversial areas, right? Because we start to get into doctrinal differences between Christians. Some of those differences are kind of around essential doctrines that are more important. Others of those, we can get into debates about the nature of salvation, what salvation is, how a person is saved. That gets a little bit deeper and more intense. But then we also get into doctrines about the second coming of Christ and events like the rapture and so on. And so we tend to get caught up in those debates. But those debates are they are entirely intramural, okay, meaning that they are debates among Christians. There are debates between fellow believers. But when we talk about the face of the various world religions, we're talking about something really completely different. And so for tonight, kind of as an introduction to this class, as you can see, we call it a question of faith. I really want to begin by getting a broader overview. We're going to break down the details of what various religions believe and so on in the coming weeks. But tonight I just want to kind of start off with kind of an introductory overview that's kind of going to lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about in weeks to come. It's important for us to understand that the world, when it comes to spiritual belief, first of all, we have to take off the table, for the purposes of our discussion, we're taking off the table all non-theistic belief systems, okay? That's not going to be a part of this class. If you're interested in talking about agnosticism and atheism and that kind of thing, that's for another time and another place. But this is specifically going to be focused on people of faith. So that automatically eliminates a certain number of people from discussion, okay? Because we've got a significant number of people, particularly in the Western world, who have no particular faith and no particular spiritual worldview. In fact, their worldview doesn't really include anything spiritual at all, okay? They would pretty much reject the supernatural. You would have people, agnostics and atheists, who kind of lead the way in what I would call the war against the supernatural worldview. And they are literally, many of them are very, very militant in their attacks on people that have a supernatural worldview. And they would decry any view that they would consider supernaturalism, okay, which is a broad umbrella that includes all religious faiths. They would attack any view that they would consider to be supernaturalism as being rooted in superstition, okay, and rooted in foolishness. But true people who are truly engaged in the struggle for reason have come to the point where their minds, their reason has triumphed over the need for faith. And they have progressed beyond the need for faith. Now that, in my opinion, this is my opinion, of course, that, in my opinion, is also a faith. The people who deny faith require faith to deny faith, okay? Because essentially they're proclaiming about things unknown. They're proclaiming about that which is unknowable absolute certainty, okay? You can see this very clearly in some of the online discussions. I recommend you go on YouTube and look up, discussions and debates with some of the various atheists. Richard Dawkins being the most prominent of those and the most vocal. Christopher Hitchens has passed away now, but he was among the more vocal as well. But Richard Dawkins still remains with us, and he still remains kind of the tip of the spear, is what I would call militant atheism. But his argumentation, when you finally strip away everything from it and you get it down to its bare essentials, is still a statement of faith. Okay? It's still a statement of faith. There is no God as a statement of faith. Because ultimately, and I've heard an Oxford theologian who is a very well-known theologian in the Christian world, who has kind of pinned him down on this in a discussion in an interview where he said, Mr. Dawkins, out there in the broader universe, in some corner of the universe of which you have no knowledge, could there be a God? And Dawkins' answer is absolutely not. Such an idea is fanciful and ludicrous, okay? So, in other words, Mr. Dawkins is claiming a kind of an omniscience about himself, that I know everything there is to know about the larger universe, even those things that are beyond the scope of my knowing, right? So, to me, as far as I'm concerned, that's as great a statement of faith as Jesus loves me, this I know, right? In fact, it's a greater statement of faith, in my opinion, a greater leap of faith to argue that there is no God than there is to argue that there's a God. But needless to say, that debate is not for this class. Our debate and our concern is what people believe about God and about the nature of spiritual reality. So therefore, to begin, we're going to kind of break the world into two spheres. Okay? And hopefully by the time we end this session tonight, which, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, who knows? Just kidding. But hopefully we'll break the world down in such a way that you'll leave here with an understanding, with your head wrapped around the idea that there really are only two ways in which religious people view their world. Okay? There really are only two fundamental ways in which religious people view their world, and it really breaks down, it really is that simple, okay? And it breaks down into what I call Eastern spirituality and Western spirituality, okay? Eastern spirituality and Western spirituality. Now, most of us, because we've grown up in the Western world and we've grown up in the Western educational tradition, or we've grown up in the Western faith tradition, or maybe a mixture of both, we're very familiar with the Western side of that equation, but we're not as familiar with the Eastern side of the equation. In fact, it's not until you actually go there and live there, or you actually do some in-depth study of the Eastern worldview, that you begin to understand how different it is from the way in which we view the world. And indeed, how different it is from the way in which we approach religious faith, okay? So when we talk about East versus West, it really is a question of worldview, and nowhere is that more true than in the spiritual realm, okay, with what they believe about spirituality. And if I could narrow it down into something really easy for you to, if you take notes at all, something easy for you to take hold of and grasp, it's this. It's Western personal God, Eastern impersonal. Okay? Western personal God, Eastern impersonal. And you'll notice that I did not add impersonal God. Okay? Because in the Eastern worldview of many Eastern religions, there is even an uncertainty about who God is and about the nature of God. And I'll try to explain that a little bit as we go a little bit more in depth into the various Eastern religions, because we're gonna look at those and we're kind of going to take those apart. But here's what you need to understand. Everything you need to know about Eastern religion, you learned in Star Wars. Okay? Seriously. Everything you need to understand about the Eastern worldview, the Eastern religious worldview, you learned in Star Wars. In fact, When George Lucas made the first Star Wars film, George Lucas was at that time a practicing Buddhist. He had converted from childhood Catholicism to Buddhism and had begun to explore the philosophical beliefs of Buddhism in some depth. And so, therefore, his budding Buddhist spirituality informed everything that he wrote into the screenwriting for the first film, Star Wars. Okay, so I literally mean that. Everything you need to understand about Eastern religion can be understood by grasping Star Wars. Okay, what is Star Wars' concept of God? The Force, right? May the Force be with you, right? Now, here's a question. Those of you who've seen Star Wars, you'll know the answer to this question. Is the Force good or evil? It is both, right? The answer to that question is it is neither good nor evil. It is neutral. And it is made either good or evil by the person who wields its power. Okay? So you can wield the same power for good, for righteousness, right? To crusade for what is right and what is righteous, or you can wield the same power to use it for dark or evil purposes, right? Now, and I think the essence of that captures the essence of Eastern spirituality on many levels, because that is basically, fundamentally, the core of Eastern thinking. God, as they understand him, is not so much a personal being, okay? When we think of God as manifest in some form that we can relate to, okay? That God is a being with some actual real substance, okay? Whereas in the Eastern worldview, God is not necessarily a person. And I know that your mind is probably, you're probably right now thinking, if any of you have done any reading about Hinduism or Buddhism, you'll know that there are many figures that they honor as great spiritual figures, right? However, the way their understanding of that and our understanding of that concept are two very different things, okay? There have been, down through the centuries, in the Eastern worldview, there have been many people that were what they would refer to as avatars. Okay? And an avatar simply means one who shows the way. One who shows the way. This is a person who, by living example, demonstrates to us what it means to be spiritual. This person is not in and of themselves the way, okay? They are showing the way. They're showing the way to be a truly spiritual person, or as they would refer to it, an enlightened person, a person who has reached a certain stage or state of enlightenment, right? And the idea behind Eastern religion is simply this: there is out there a great cosmic power, okay? But that cosmic power, and that cosmic power created everything that we see. It created the material universe. It created you and I as living human beings, okay? However, that great cosmic power is ultimately unknowable in any kind of a personal sense. So there is no, in that Eastern worldview, there is no concept of, we might ask a person, have you been saved, as an evangelical Christian? They wouldn't even understand the concept. The idea would ever even enter their mind, right? Because do you have a personal relationship with Jesus or a personal relationship with God? Again, a foreign concept, right? And here's the essence of it, okay? As part of this created world and larger created universe, we are essentially pieces of, fragments of the divine. Okay? We are pieces of or fragments of the divine. There is a divine out there, a divine mind, and they're not, again, they're not really concerned with defining who or what that is, right? That divine mind could be male, could be female, whatever, That's not even important either. It's simply a great force of energy, a great power that exists in the universe that created all things, including you and me, but not created in the sense that we think of as created. Because when we think of as created, what I think of is I think of a guy going into his workshop and creating something, right? That's how we think in Western terms. We think of a man going into his shop out behind his house, and if he's a woodworker, you know, making something out of wood, making a bowl, right? I remember making a bowl when I was young and in woodworking class in high school, and I was not a gifted woodworker. I broke several of those things that you use to, those of you who are more familiar with woodworking know what I'm talking about, but the little thing that carves the wood out while it's spinning on the little machine, you're grinding the wood out. I broke several of those because I didn't know how to hold it just right. You know, there's a right way to hold it to make sure that you're right. That's what I think of when I think of a person creating something or making something, right? But that's not the Eastern concept at all. The Eastern concept is that somewhere in the distant past, however ancient our universe and however ancient life in our universe is, a piece of that great power broke off, if you will. I'm just using, you know, terms that we can wrap our head around. I'm not sure even Eastern people would use that concept or that idea. But like a piece of that divine broke off, and from that piece of the divine came the first man, the first woman, the first animals, okay? But they all of those things came from the same piece of the divine, right? All of them did. They're all created from the same piece of the divine. In other words, you or I are just as divine as this great divine power. We're on the same level of divinity as this great divine power because we literally come from this great divine power. And people say, well, you know, I mean, that some of that makes some sense to me. Okay, well, let's follow that through, okay? If we're a piece that broke off of the divine power, then what is our ultimate destiny? You might say, well, it's surely then to shape the world in our image. No. No, that's not the Eastern worldview at all. The Eastern worldview is because you broke off from the great divine power, your ultimate goal in life is to go back to the great divine power, to return to it, okay? Because you were once part of it, you somehow got separated from it, and now you must figure out how to regain union with it, right? And until we, as a race of people, regain that unity with the divine power, we will never know what greatness is meant for us, okay? In other words, out of this great cosmic power, we're all made, but ultimately our making is meaningless, is ultimately meaningless, as long as we remain separated from the divine power, which we must somehow go back and be merged with. And if we become merged with the divine power, then guess what happens to us? We cease to exist. We literally become merged with this great force in the universe, and we as individuals cease to exist. Which, of course, raises the question, why did we exist in the first place? Okay? And there's all kinds of different answers to that depending on which Eastern philosopher you ask. Okay? Why did we exist? Why did we even come into existence? If our whole purpose is to eventually get back to that state of union with the energies of the universe, then why were we ever broken off from the energies of the universe to become what we are in the first place? Okay? So for this reason, even though ultimately, okay, we'll get into some of the contradictory concepts here in just a moment. But for this reason, most practitioners of Eastern faiths, their goal, their ultimate goal, is to become so one with the cosmic spiritual reality of this great oversoul of the universe that they lose their personal identity altogether. Okay? And this is something that we as Westerners, we see it and we don't understand it. For example, we'll go to India, a country where, in spite of the fact that their economy has grown over the past 30 years at a staggering rate. How many of you understand or realize that India's economy is the second fastest growing only behind China? It's amazing. Their standard of living has risen like a skyrocket over the last 30 to 40 years. Okay? They're enjoying greater wealth in their culture than we enjoyed during the boom years of the Roaring 20s. Just exploding. High rises going up in major cities and huge companies relocating there and big money and huge financial centers. It's incredible. And yet in the midst of that, right next to the gleaming spires of industry and prosperity, is some of the most grinding poverty in the world. And it's shocking to Westerners when they go there. It's shocking. I have a friend that's a missionary there, has been for a number of years, and he said the thing that still blows people away when they go over there to be involved in missions work, because he's tied in with a couple of different missions organizations, and he said the thing that always blows first-timers over there on the mission field, blows them away, is that here's a society where the standard of living is rapidly increasing. There's a booming middle class, burgeoning middle class, living in high-rent districts, in these huge high-rises, in these gleaming apartments. The place is just like a model almost of the kind of economic prosperity that capitalism can bring. And yet literally right down the road, a mile or two down the road, is a shanty town in which people are living in the worst possible imaginable conditions. And he said what shocks people the most is that no one in Indian society, he's in India, seems at all concerned about it. When we see poverty in the Western world, our first thought is to alleviate it, right? Poverty is a problem that needs to be fixed. That's how Western society sees things, okay? That's how the traditional theistic view of the world sees things. If people are in suffering, suffering is something that we should do whatever we can, whatever's within our power, to help alleviate. Now, that doesn't mean we can alleviate all suffering. There's all kinds of reasons why suffering exists, but that we should be trying to put forth every effort to try and make things better, okay? Whereas in these cultures that are very much in the grip of an Eastern philosophy of life, there is very, very little concern about trying to improve the lot of the poorest of the poor. Now, here's why. Because every single person is on a journey. Every single person. And their journey is a journey back to be reunited with the great oversoul of the universe. And whatever is going on now in this life is a part of that process. So if you interfere with that process, you're actually short-circuiting the process by which they are eventually going to return to a state of union with the great oversoul. Okay? Now, to us, that's just like, wow, what in the world? So therefore, you can have people living in the ultimate luxury, and you can have people living in absolute desperation side by side in the same city, but they're all on the journey to going back to the great energy force of the universe. And it's all about how they respond to their circumstances. Okay? It's all about how they respond to their circumstances. The person who is in a low state in this life is there for a reason. And it's most likely because they lived a previous life. Reincarnation is such a huge part of this. It's most likely because they lived a previous life poorly. So they're getting recycled as an extremely poor person in an opportunity to possibly improve their spiritual state so that they might have a hope of reuniting with the great oversoul of the universe, right? And guess what? They can get recycled hundreds of times through this life in an effort to bring them back into harmony with the forces of the universe. And ultimately, that harmony with the forces of the universe is what it's all about. It's what it's all about, okay? That is, I think you would agree with me, and like I said, we're going to peel away the layers of that and talk in more detail about that worldview, but I think you would agree, just on a superficial view of it, that is a worldview that is so foreign, not just talking about terms of foreign in terms of culture, but so foreign to our way of thinking that we can't even relate to it. We can't even understand what motivates people to think in that way, but that is the tradition in which they're rooted. So when you talk about the Eastern world, you're talking about all of Asia. Every single part of Asia. The only parts of Asia where this worldview does not apply are in the parts of Asia where either some other form of theism has come in and dominated the ancient traditions, or a godless system like communism has come in and simply uprooted all belief systems and has outlawed the practice of Eastern faith, okay? But outside of the communist countries of China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, the countries where the government is militantly anti-religious, and outside of the islands of the Indian Ocean, which we'll talk about that in a minute, and portions of India where Islam has taken root, and where today Islam is the dominant faith. Outside of those areas, this philosophy of life, this worldview still exists. And by the way, may I say this, even the practitioners of the Eastern worldview, here's what they'll say. You'll say something along the lines of, wow, you guys just stood by and allowed Muslims to take over East Timor and to violently advance their jihad all across Indonesia to the point where almost all of Indonesia today, with the exception of a tiny little segment, is militantly Islamic. Now, please understand, the practice of Islam in Indonesia is by no means the religion of peace. It is super militant. They're among the most militant followers of Islam in the world, which is amazing because they're all Asians. They don't have any Arabic roots whatsoever, but they have become among the most fanatical and violent adherents of Islam in the world. And yet, you'll talk to the average Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, in that part of the world, or even in India, in the former part of India now called Pakistan, right? And they'll tell you, even if they're practitioners of their ancient faiths, they'll tell you, oh, well, it was just meant to be. It's just karma. We've inherited somewhere along the line, this is our punishment. And so therefore, we're just kind of fatalistically accepting whatever comes down the pike historically, because we're being purified somehow through all of it. Purified and prepared to be reunited with the great spiritual oversoul, okay? So that was the Eastern worldview. Now, as you can well imagine, the Eastern worldview was very passive. Very passive. And extreme pacifism to the point of simply laying down and allowing whatever to happen, okay? It's a very passive worldview. It's not quite fatalism, but it's very, very close to a fatalistic worldview. So for that reason, when other faiths began to come in and challenge that worldview got plowed under. okay? And by other faiths, I'm including communism, which is a godless faith, you know, an atheistic faith. But they came along and just plowed those faiths under. But it's very important to understand those faiths are very resilient. So they still exist, and they are still practiced. Even though they might not be publicly acknowledged, and even though the governments of those countries might have done everything within their power, particularly in Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia where Islam has taken hold, they've done everything within their power to snuff it out. Those faiths still exist because there are people who still hold to those faith traditions. They might do so in secret, they might do so quietly, practicing those faith traditions, but those faith traditions still hold on, okay? So you needn't think that those faiths have just disappeared, okay? Now we come over to the Western side of the equation. That was not so hard for us to understand because that's us. This is what we are, okay? We too have certain foundational principles that make us differ from the Eastern side of the religious equation. First and foremost, a personal God. A personal God. And not just a personal God who's out there somewhere floating around on the edge of the universe, okay? But a personal God who has chosen to involve himself, and I'm not trying to be offensive here at all, but it's very much a himself, okay? The Western worldview of God is patriarchal to the core. So the people that are attacking and hate the patriarchy, they're attacking and hate the Western worldview of God, okay? The Western worldview of God is that God is a him, and that God, he, wants to know mankind. And so therefore, that God has taken steps to reveal himself to mankind. All right? That's the essence of it. And that God has not only revealed himself for who he is, a great, powerful, all-knowing, all-wise, all-compassionate, all-merciful creator who created everything there is, right? But he's also revealed his will, his law, his rules for living, his purpose for human life. So I think that you can very quickly grasp the fact that the Western worldview and the Eastern worldview are very, very different views of God, right? Because in the Eastern worldview, morality, where does it come from? Where does morality come from? There is no God who comes down from heaven to make his moral will known. There is no personal deity who comes to reveal himself, right, as the all-wise, all-knowing creator of all things. So therefore, morality is morality is very much in limbo, right? It really is. It really is. I mean, and when you actually sit down with a person who's a practitioner of Eastern religion and you ask them about morality, the answers are equally vague, okay? Because it's really, really hard to nail down moral precepts in Eastern religion when you don't even have a God that you can nail down, right? When your concept of God is kind of amorphous and sort of kind of vapor, if you will, then it's very, very hard to have any sense of concrete morality. Whereas in the Western tradition, God has spoken, okay? God has spoken and has made his will very clear and has even had his will written down, okay? Carved in stone, if I may borrow that phrase, right? Carved in stone so that there's no uncertainty about what his requirements and his demands are, right? And so that is the religious world in which we live. Now, you say, well, what worldview do people hold to? I mean, is there a distinct line between Eastern and Western? Well, there once was. I would argue that as late as the 1800s, the late 1800s, there was almost like an invisible wall between East and West, right? missionaries who traveled to the east to try and take the gospel there, they came up against a worldview that was very, very foreign to them. It was something that they had to learn about. They had to learn how to communicate the truth of their gospel to a people who were accustomed to the concept of an energy source that wasn't even personalized. Okay? So they're trying to bring into that world through evangelical outreach a very different way of seeing things. But now, today, our world is much smaller. Much smaller. And what has changed all of that? Communications. Communications. Do not, as a Westerner, do not underestimate the power that Western invention has had in changing the world. Isn't it ironic? Western invention, right, which has emerged as a direct result. Western invention and creativity is rooted in the concept of a personal God. It really is, right? God has given us a mandate, and that mandate is to rule the earth and subdue it, right? And so for centuries, Western man was all about the conquest, right? The conquest of, and automatically people in today's culture, in today's society, because our kids have been so poisoned by the mind virus that is wokeness, they immediately think of conquest purely in terms of taking another person's land and oppressing them. But no. Think of conquest in much bigger terms. How about conquest of disease? Think about it. Aren't you glad that someone looked at polio and said, we got to stop that? Aren't you glad? Aren't you glad that Jonas Salk came up with a cure for a disease that at the time was rampaging? It was growing. In fact, at the time that Salk came up with his vaccine, which we sucked on a little sugar cube when I was a kid, a little pink stuff, right? But at the time he came up with it, polio was afflicting well over 1/4 of all young Americans were being afflicted with it to some degree or another, okay? Some cases more severe, some cases less severe, right? So, I'm glad for advances in medicine. I'm alive because of advances in medicine. Seriously. You say, well, you're alive because the Lord kept you alive. Yeah? Them and Dr. Berkowitz in Greensboro, North Carolina. My cardiothoracic surgeon who went up inside my completely clogged arteries coming up out of the lower part of my body and went with a balloon and stuck 2 stents in there, and all of a sudden I got my blood flow back. You do realize that not that many years before that surgical procedure, I'd have checked on out of here. I wouldn't be here talking to you tonight. Okay? So I'm grateful that Western thinking and Western thought and the Western view of the world looks at things and says there are things to conquer. There are conquests to be won. The conquest of disease, the conquest of poverty. Lifting the world out of poverty, right? The Western world has done more to do that. My gosh, there would be no charity if it weren't for the Western world. Let me just break it down for you, okay? Let's make it even more simple. If it weren't for the United States and Great Britain, there would be no charity in the world. That's fact. And you say, well, how about Canada? Not by much. But literally, take the United States and Great Britain out of the picture, there would be no world charity. Third world nations would still be starving. People would still be dying of disease all over the world, disease that would be easily curable, but it's changed. Our position in the world has changed the world, and it's changed it for the better, right? Let me ask you this. Would a fatalistic worldview that basically says we're just here to kind of muddle along and hopefully eventually reunite with the energy field, right? Is that ever going to produce greatness? Not in my opinion. But what about a worldview that says there's a God and He has spoken and He has given us a mandate and here's His mandate laid out for us in Scripture? That's a world-building worldview. This is not a world-building worldview. This is a world-building worldview. This is a worldview that says there are things we can do to make the world a better place. And okay, please understand that right now, in the way I'm talking about this, I'm removing this entirely from the spiritual and just talking about the practical things that the Western world has done, okay? We're going to talk about spiritual stuff plenty, okay? But the bottom line being that which worldview has produced greater things for the world, has made the world a more prosperous place, has made life better for more people, because I really think we grossly underestimate the way in which Western technology has advanced the world. One of the things that surprised me the most in visiting South Africa was that everybody has a cell phone. Everybody. From the least to the greatest. The poorest worker living on the game farm who lives in a rental house there on the edge of the property, you know, and works a basic 9-to-5 work-a-day job, he's got a cell phone and cellular service, wireless service. So guess what? He's in touch with the world. He's in touch with the world. He can go out and read and learn and listen and hear. And so as a result of the advancement of technology across the face of the earth, and it's everywhere. I've talked with missionaries in India. They say, you wouldn't believe, tribal people way back up in the hills of India that have cell phones. What in the world? Right? But why? What's happening here? I mean, I remember Hannah when she went to Southeast Asia, and she was talking about how ubiquitous cell phones were in Southeast Asia. They're everywhere. And television and everything else. The internet penetrates. So it's like, what's happening? The world is growing smaller. So let's circle back to that point. As the world grows smaller, what happens? We get exposed to their worldview, and they get exposed to ours. And the result of it is what? A confused mishmash of ideas. It's really true, okay? So that we end up with so many religious blends, you know? It's like we throw in a little dash of this and put in a little dash of that, and we might want to keep a little dash of grandma's Christian faith, but we're going to mix in a healthy dose of Buddhism over here or what have you, and whirl the blender up, and this is my own special exotic mix of religion. And that's really what we're dealing with. That's really what we're dealing with, especially in the Western world. Because we're getting exposed to ideas that many people in the Western world, like I said, 100 years ago, these ideas would have been foreign to them. But now they're suddenly being exposed to them, so much so that you now have, think about the celebrities. Think about the celebrities. Think about pop culture, okay? And when you think about pop culture, you think about, this is one of my favorites, okay? One of my favorites is Madonna. Remember her? She was popular once upon a time. Was Madonna a few years ago, probably about a decade ago, claiming to be a Hindu. Now, as we go through this study and we study what Hinduism actually believes and practice, you'll laugh at the thought of Madonna being a Hindu, okay? Madonna was no Hindu. Madonna might be a lot of things, and one of them, of course, is very, very, very confused, but she's no Hindu, okay? What had she done? She had adopted certain ideas that sounded attractive to her from Hinduism, imported them into whatever esoteric faith she was creating, and created a blender mix of her own version of Hinduism, which has no bearing whatsoever. Let me tell you something. Hinduism, properly practiced, is a very ascetic faith. It's ultimate self-denial. It's fasting to the point of starvation, right? Because your whole goal is to what? Detach from this material world and go back and become reconnected to the great oversoul. So the last thing you want to be is material girl, right? Okay? But Madonna could easily take a little bit of Hinduism, a little dabble of it over here, blend it with a little bit of Jewish mysticism because she is Jewish, and so she borrows from Kabbalism, which is kind of an esoteric sort of occult thing that grew out of Judaism. She borrows a little bit of that, a little bit of her, Catholic upbringing and so on, and she blends it all together in a blender, and out comes Madonna religion, right? And it's what I like to call designer religion, okay? But for the purposes of our study together, going into getting off into the weeds of designer religion is not the goal, because we will easily become lost if we start trying to chase every rabbit. Instead, we have to focus in on the core beliefs of the major religions, first of all. Now, you'll notice on the slide, it says world religions and cults. So I need to make very clear where we're going with that, okay? We're going to study the tenets of all the major world religions, beginning with the Eastern ones and then moving over to the Western ones, okay? We're going to talk about them. And there are basically 3 and 3, a total of 6 major world religions. And you say, well, Pastor Don, what about this one and this one and this one? No. Again, getting into the weeds. I could get into every religion there is on the face of the planet, and we would be here, well, as Deb pointed out earlier, whole college courses, entire degrees dedicated to the study of religions, and we're not going to get into that. We're going to get into those faiths which have millions of adherents worldwide. So what I would consider to be a comprehensive study of world religions, you could insert the word major world religions, okay, in order to understand where we're going to go, because we're going to study the 6 major world religions. 3 of them are Eastern, 3 of them are Western. And we're going to talk about their similarities, their differences, and so on, okay? When it comes to cults, however, we're going to narrow the field, because every religion has cults. Might not realize that. Islam has cults. The Jews have cults, okay? Buddhism has its cults. Every major world religion has its cults, but for the purposes of our class, we're going to focus on Christian cults. And what we mean by cults is a group that claims to be Christian. Their advertising and their public relations is, we're a Christian group. Might even use the cross, right? Might even use Jesus a lot in their materials. But that ultimately have so far departed from the faith that they can no longer be considered Christian, because they have denied some essential doctrine of the faith, because they've taken our faith, the Christian faith, and have twisted it like a pretzel to become something it was never meant to be, okay? And so for our purposes in the study of cults, we're going to focus on the Christian cults, because they're the ones that you're going to have the most interaction with. They're the most common in our culture. They're the ones you're going to run into on the streets or in your daily interaction at your job or whatever. Very seldom would you run into Janism, okay? In fact, most of you look at me like, well, what is Janism? Exactly, because it's not a group that we're going to have any kind of interaction with. If we lived in the East, maybe, but we don't. We live in America. So who are we going to interact with? We're going to interact with Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Children of God, various different Christian groups, so-called Christian groups that are out there that I consider to be gospel twisting, okay, or faith twisting, so much so that they have departed from the essence of Christian doctrine. So that's where we're coming from, okay? But how do we, let me close with this, okay? It truly is a question of faith. It really is. And when we began our journey as Christians, we began with a decision, right? In evangelical Christian circles, we call it being born again, right? But it really is a decision. We don't put much emphasis on that anymore. I know that Billy Graham used to put a great deal of emphasis on it. God bless him. But he used to emphasize the rational decision of following Jesus Christ as Lord. That's why you rarely ever in a Billy Graham crusade heard him make an emotional appeal, okay? He didn't try to get people crying and tell mama stories, and weigh on people's emotions to get them to come down the aisle. He simply stood up, proclaimed Jesus as Lord, and said, now, you have a decision to make as to whether or not, in fact, they used to call his television show and his radio show the Day of Decision. How many of y'all remember that? That back in the old days, right? Because he was calling for people to make a decision to follow Christ. It's always a question of faith. So for me, my goal in this class is to present the reality of what these faiths teach and then ask you which one makes the most sense. Which one makes the most sense when you consider every factor, and in particular you consider the human condition, right? Which one of the faiths we're going to talk about makes the most sense? Which one is the most rational, the most reasonable? And I'm not going to even pretend to try and convince you from a rational standpoint, but I do think there is ultimately a rational case to be made. All right? So over the next several weeks, we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the three major Eastern religions, the three major Western religions, and then in the week following or 2 weeks following, we'll talk about the cults. Okay? All right. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for this class. And for the material that we're covering here, God, I ask you to help me to present it in such a way that I can better equip Christian believers to be more effective in relating their faith, to be more rooted and grounded in their own faith so they might be able to relate it to the lost. Help us to that end. In Jesus' name.